Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I want to show you 7 different perspectives on church history using this chart that was made by a fan and posted on our Useful Charts subreddit. It does a really good job at demonstrating that there are 2 very different ways to talk about religion. There's the view from the inside and there's the view from the outside. On this chart, the first 6 timelines present church history as it would be explained from inside various denominations, whereas the final timeline presents church history from an outside perspective, in an attempt to be as objective and neutral as possible. I think it's important for people to understand the difference so that when, say, they're watching a video here on YouTube, they can distinguish between whether they're watching a religious video, meaning someone from a particular religion talking about their beliefs from an insider perspective, or a religious studies video, meaning someone who is talking about religion from an outsider perspective. Okay, so let's dive in. The first timeline shows church history from the Catholic perspective. From the Catholic perspective, the church led by Rome is the one true church, the one founded by Jesus. Other churches, such as the Eastern Orthodox Church led by Constantinople, or the Protestants, split from them, and to this day they remain separated from the main body of Christians, which is the Catholic Church, led by the Pope. In contrast, from the Orthodox perspective, it was the Catholics who split from them, and are therefore now separated from the one true church. And since the Protestants split from the Catholics, they are even more separated from the main body of Christians, which is the Eastern Orthodox Church. In both cases, the Oriental Orthodox Church, in places like Egypt and Ethiopia, is seen as being a branch that split off even earlier. Next, let's skip to the Lutheran Reformed timeline. Here, the idea is that the original church eventually became corrupted during the Middle Ages, but was then put back on the right path by the Protestant Reformation. So, in this view, the mainline Protestant denominations, such as the Anglicans, Lutherans, and Calvinists, represent a continuation of the one true church, whereas the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox are separations that continue to carry vestiges of the medieval corruption. The Anglican perspective is similar, but has a softer view towards other churches. For example, when it comes to the Great Schism, it sees neither the Catholic Church nor the Eastern Orthodox Church as being the one true church, but rather as being different branches. Just like they, the Anglicans, are yet another branch. Then we come to the Baptist trail of blood theory, which I should point out is not actually held by most Baptists. Most Baptists today would more likely adhere to something closer to the Lutheran Reformed theory. But this particular theory stands out to me because it's the one that I was taught as a kid, growing up in the Worldwide Church of God, albeit with a small twist. Here, the idea is that the one true church went into hiding sometime after the Council of Nicaea, and that all the big churches are, well, to put it frankly, wrong. In this view, certain Baptist churches today, while few in number in the grand scheme of things, are the direct descendants of the true, sometimes hidden church that has always existed. Now, what I was taught as a kid was that the Worldwide Church of God was the continuation of that one true church. And while I no longer believe that, there are, in fact, some churches that still do. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the Seventh-day Adventists believe something akin to this particular theory as well. Next up is a view that's a little more common, as it's the one held by Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as Restorationist churches, such as the Disciples of Christ and the Churches of Christ. Here, the idea is that the original church fell very early on into apostasy, meaning that they veered off the correct path, and that for centuries there was no one true church in existence. But then, due to the work of either Joseph Smith, Charles Russell, or Stone and Campbell, the church was restored, and therefore either the LDS or Churches of Christ represent the one true church today. So what all of these perspectives so far have in common is that they are views from the inside. So, for example, if you were to go to a theology department in a school associated with one of the above churches, you might be taught something along those lines. However, if you were to go to a religious studies department, what you would be taught would be something similar to this last timeline. And that is that basically the original church has had a lot of splits over the years, and that no one branch is necessarily more right than any other. They're just different. You see, the goal of religious studies
How did the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints come to embrace the King James Version as their official English language Bible? The story is actually a lot more recent than you might assume. The Latter-day Saints are studying the Old Testament this year as part of their Sunday school and home study curriculum, and in advance, the church released a statement that surprised some onlookers. While it says that the King James Version remains the official Bible for church settings, members are now not only allowed, but encouraged to refer to other translations in order to gain help in their study. This change is also reflected in the church's handbook. It would be hard to overstate the significance of this evolution. I remember when I was a Sunday school teacher, I got in trouble for referring to a translation from a particularly thorny New Testament verse from the New Revised Standard Version. I hope that this means that many Latter-day Saints will feel more comfortable to refer to these other verses and participate in the broader Christian community. So while the KJV continues to hold this status of not an exclusive Bible anymore, but still the official Bible, that move that had made the KJV the exclusive Bible in the LDS tradition for English-speaking members is actually a rather recent development. So in this video, I want to walk through how the King James Version evolved from being the common Bible among Latter-day Saints to the exclusive Bible among English-speaking Latter-day Saints, a position it only lost, again, a few weeks ago. This story, besides just being fascinating in its own right, actually tells us a lot about Latter-day Saints. It tells us about how they approach Scripture, the influence of broader cultural currents, as well as the evolution of institutional priorities and interpretations. So with all that said, let's dig in. It would be hard to overstate how much the Bible shaped early American religious culture, including the Latter-day Saints. Now, if you haven't yet, make sure to watch my video from last week where I talked about the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, which was a good primer or an introduction in how the Bible shaped Joseph Smith's early understanding of the Restoration tradition and the evolution of his own ideas. During that time, early American Protestants were evolving in their biblical priorities. The Geneva Bible had been the primary English language Bible for Protestants, especially the Puritans, but across the 18th century and into the early 19th century, the King James Version had come to supplant the Geneva Bible. Now, Joseph Smith's own family likely used both the Geneva Bible and the KJV, but the KJV soon took a much more privileged status among American Protestants in juxtaposition to the Catholics. The KJV was the Protestant Bible. And we can see how the KJV shaped early Latter-day Saints, especially Joseph Smith's notion of the sacred, in how Joseph Smith incorporated the language from the KJV into the Book of Mormon and then Joseph Smith's own revelations. That is going to be quite crucial later on in the story, this shared overlap in language, that the KJV came to signify what scriptural language sounds like. Now, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and others would actually say that that language itself is not the key part. It's just the vehicle to give the message. And we see this especially in Joseph Smith and how Joe Smith spoke about the Bible, including the KJV. He frequently critiqued the KJV as not pure in its presentation of sacred teachings. In fact, one of the key elements in the Joe Smith translation of the Bible, which I talked about in the video last week, was trying to modernize the language. Now, I know there's a bit of a paradox here that on the one hand, Joe Smith is replicating the KJV language with some of his scriptural texts, while also trying to modernize it with the JST, but I think this shows an evolution in his thinking. Elsewhere, Joe Smith would claim that there are plain and precious truths that were lost in the Bible, and so the KJV was representing that corruption and cannot be fully recognized as the key encapsulation, the possessor of those scriptural truths from Jesus Christ's time and from the Old Testament. So throughout Joseph Smith's life, the KJV is kind of the unstated official common Bible of Latter-day Saints, but it's far from the exclusive Bible, nor did they celebrate the KJV as the best version of the Bible. They just kind of took it for granted like many other Protestants, while highlighting its shortcomings. And before we go further, I need to do the boring business of my channel. If you enjoy this type of nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed. I try to do deep dives on particular topics every Mondays. I connect the past to the present on Wednesdays, and I talk about the historian's craft every Friday. The first Wednesday of every month, I do a live discussion. Last week, I did a live discussion with Dan McClellan, the wonderful biblical scholar, where we talk about Mormons in the scripture. If you didn't tune in, make sure to go watch that now. I also recommend subscribing to my Kit newsletter. There's a link in the video description that just gives you typically a bi-weekly reminder of what I'm up to, the videos I'm doing on different platforms, upcoming events, and so forth. And speaking of upcoming events, I am coming out to Utah for the Utah Historical Society's awards banquet. And while I'm out there, the great folks at Benchmark Books, the best Mormon history bookstore in Utah, in Salt Lake City, has arranged for me to do some book signings on Tuesday, January 27th from 5 to 6 p.m. at Benchmark Books in Salt Lake City. I hope to see some of you there. And if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for those of you who do, you can become a member of this channel, where for a very nominal monthly fee, you can get early access to the videos and show your appreciation and enable both me and my wonderful producer, Anthony, to continue doing our work to perpetuate these discussions on important historical topics. All right, I think I covered all the business. Let's get back to the KJV and the LDS. For the next century after Joseph Smith's death, the KJV continues to hold this unofficial but increasingly entrenched position as the common Bible within the Latter-day Saints. And there are several moments and tensions that solidify that, though it's far from exclusive. That's not going to come until the 1950s, which I'll get to in a bit. Ironically, one of the moments that really pushed the Latter-day Saints to more fully embrace the KJV was Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, because as I discussed in last week's video, the RLDS Church published what they called the inspired version of the Bible, what Latter-day Saints call, what Utah Saints call the JST. They published that in the 1860s, and Latter-day Saints out in Utah did not trust the RLDS publication, and so they denounced it, and that they emphasized that no, you might have that version, which we can't verify you're actually being faithful to the Joseph Smith's actual record. We are going to embrace the KJV as our Bible, which is one of the great ironies that the very scriptural text that Joe Smith produced to try to wean the Latter-day Saints away from the KJV ends up pushing the Latter-day Saints toward the KJV a few decades later. It's just one of the great ironies of LDS history. And that denominational rivalry between the LDS in Utah and the RLDS out in Missouri is going to shape a lot of Latter-day Saint view of scripture and doctrine, including, as you can tell, in the Bible. But the other key tension that Latter-day Saints are responding to that pushes them closer toward the KJV in the late 1800s and early 1900s is the growth of the secular academy's interpretation of biblical text, what we call higher criticism of the Bible, in which scholars are trying to get behind the historical development of these documents and in some ways whittling away the sacred truths and myths that surround those texts, which worried a lot of religious leaders, including Latter-day Saints. And so in response to what they see as secular academic corruptions of the text, many Latter-day Saint leaders start embracing evangelical understandings of traditional scriptural ideas. And one of those is the KJV, that by embracing the KJV, it was their way of rejecting the modern secular academy. So while they overlap with evangelicals in that way of defending the KJV and the Bible, there are some exceptionally Mormon ways of defending the KJV. And this becomes especially the case later on in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, and that's on language. Remember I mentioned earlier that a key part of this is that Joseph Smith borrowed from the language of the KJV in creating Mormon scripture, the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and others emphasized that that was just a vehicle. But now, after Joseph Smith's day, after Brigham Young's day, many Latter-day Saints come to see that language as a crucial part of Scripture. That, in other words, that's how God speaks, is in the KJV tongue, which is a very ahistorical way of thinking, but it fit into their religious worldview. And one of my favorite texts that demonstrate how far they had come in that thinking was in 1911, the Deseret Evening News, which was the church's newspaper, published a celebration of the 300th anniversary of the King James Version of the Bible. And in that celebratory text, they said, we know that the KJV is not only the best Bible, but it is the inspired version. And how do we know that it's inspired? Because it has the same language we find in the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. So therefore it shows that that's how God is speaking. Just note that ironic turnabout, that instead of seeing the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants as borrowing the language from the KJV, they are now seeing the KJV's language as vindicated because it matches Joseph Smith's scriptural language in the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants. Although I will still emphasize that even by that point, the early 1900s, the early 20th century, Latter-day Saints still haven't fully embraced the KJV as the exclusive Bible. They're just saying it's the best, it's the common. The move to exclusive status does not come until the post-World War II era, and it's connected to a particular church leader. Those of you who have read my book, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, or are familiar with this channel, especially my discussions of modern Mormonism in the 20th century, aren't going to be surprised when I say that J. Reuben Clark is a central figure in this story. J. Reuben Clark, I've frequently argued, is the architect of modern Mormonism. And it's especially the case in their view of the KJV Bible. See, J. Reuben Clark detested modern scholarship. He denounced the secular academy as chipping away of sacred truths. He's borrowing from broader American evangelical and fundamentalist ideas in doing so. And so when he saw these liberal Christians in the modern academy produce a new version of the Bible, the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, around 1950. First they get the New Testament and then the Old Testament. It was endorsed by the National Council of Churches, which was seen as the more liberal church, and many of the more conservative evangelical and fundamentalist groups, the groups that J. Reuben Clark sympathized with, denounced this new translation as a corruption of their sacred truth. Now, a lot of evangelicals are going to then support the NIV, the New International Version, which matched their theological background. But J. Reuben Clark goes the other direction. J. Reuben Clark says that to reject this modern corruption from these liberal theologians and the secular academy, we need to double down on the KJV. So he publishes a few years later, in 1956, a book titled Why the King James Bible, which did two primary things in this massive argument. One, he regurgitates a lot of the conservative critiques and theological talking points concerning the corruption of modern academy Germany and the liberalization among these new RSV and other scriptural translations. But mixed in with that, he also invokes that Mormon reading of the KJV, that the language itself is important. It is a language of scripture. It is a language of revelation. It is the language of the divine. So on the one hand, he is borrowing the broader conservative movement, and there are many who are denouncing the RSV and other biblical translations. By the way, Joseph McCarthy, remember the anti-communist who has his House Un-American Committee, they denounce the RSV as an example of communism and communism's influence into American society, something that J. Reuben Clark would have been very sympathetic with because he was also a rabid anti-communist. While at the same time, Clark is incorporating these restorationist ideas, these Mormon principles, to reject the new RSV and the Bible and modern scholarship and the higher criticism of the Bible, and reaffirming the KJV. David O. McKay, who is the president of the church in the 1950s and the 1960s, he was actually kind of sympathetic to these new biblical translations, and J. Reuben Clark had to work hard to wean him away, saying that the language matters. The language of the KJV is the language of God, and so therefore we have to stick with it. And Clark really institutionalized that message. Besides publishing his book, Why the King James Bible, he incorporated KJV ideas and prioritization into the curriculum. He urged LDS academics, including religion professors at BYU, to defend the KJV, which many did, and perhaps most importantly, he got the wheels in motion for the church to formally adopt the KJV when they finally produced, a decade and a half after Clark's death, in 1979, the official LDS version of the Bible, the first time the LDS Church published their own version of the Bible, which includes, footnotes to the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and now the insertion of the JST passages for reasons that I discussed in last week's video. But importantly, the text of the LDS version of the Bible is the KJV. And so in many ways, that's the culmination of J. Reuben Clark's push to move the KJV not just from the common Bible to the exclusive Bible, a position the KJV is then going to hold for a half century. But, and there was going to be a big but coming, that position became unsustainable for a number of reasons. On the one hand, the LDS Church continued to celebrate the KJV as the best Bible, or at least the official Bible. Here is a news story when they celebrated the KJV's 400th anniversary. I was going to grad school out in the UK at the time, so I attended a big conference that the church sponsored at Oxford to celebrate the KJV. But the church's stance on the KJV became increasingly unsustainable for a few reasons. One, very few religions, including conservative religions, were sticking with the KJV. Many conservative evangelicals were turning to the NIV or other versions, and so Latter-day Saints were becoming increasingly isolated, which is hard to emphasize their commonality with broader Christendom when they are using a Bible that most of Christendom is moving beyond. Second, the LDS Church is becoming much more global, and as they're becoming much more global, they're reliant on other translations of the Bible and these different cultures and languages and nations, which means the KJV necessarily has to move from its perch because not all Latter-day Saints speak English, and that's going to make the church recognize that the KJV does not work as well in English as these other translations work in other languages. And third, Latter-day Saint scholars, including those religion professors at BYU, were increasingly unable to defend the KJV like previous BYU professors had. And there were many who were pushing the church, including LDS leaders, to move away from the KJV exclusivity. And you would see some leaders, like the recently deceased Jeffrey R. Holland, who would quote from other translations of the Bible in their general conference addresses, which just showed that the KJV's exclusive status was chipping away. And so that's what brought us to the LDS Church's announcements in December of 2025. So here is a portion from their supplemental material that you can find online that says some individuals may benefit from translations that are both doctrinally clear and also easier to understand. Note those two pillars. Doctrinally clear, it allows you to make sure that it fits these theological principles Bibles. J. Reuben Clark would have approved of that, but also easier to understand. That is explicitly talking about the language of the KJV not being the best at capturing or expressing the message that you're trying to see, recognizing that the KJV language was an obstacle to many. So it's still prioritizing doctrinal fidelity, but also allowing ease. The church's material here, supplemental material, even goes beyond that, highlighting several versions of translation of the Bible that Latter-day Saints might use, and including those English-speaking Latter-day Saints could use the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, which is so ironic, given that it was the RSV, the earlier version of the NRSV, that prompted J. Reuben Clark to denounce these new translations and say we need to double down on the KJV. So in other words, it's probably likely that J. Reuben Clark is rolling in his grave with this change. A change, by the way, that is reflected in the church's own handbook. That, again, not only allows, but encourages Latter-day Saints to refer to these other translations of the Bible, which is a major change from where they were before. I think there's several points of significance that we can take from this change. On the one hand, it could prompt many Latter-day Saints to a deeper study of the Bible that connects them to modern day scholarship. Where they were just relying on the KJV, it meant that Latter-day Saints were mostly isolated in how they were reading the Bible. But now, referring to these other new translations of the Bible might introduce them not just to how other Christians are reading the Bible, but how scholars are studying the Bible. So as they go out and they get their study Bibles from the NRSV or the NIV, they're going to encounter these other interpretations that might prompt deeper study and perhaps even challenge traditional ideas. The second major significance that I'm curious of is this going to chip away at the Latter-day Saints' sense of sacred language? That the KJV is no longer going to be the language of God, the language of revelation, the language of reverence. Does that mean we're going to see Latter-day Saints adopt a more modern vernacular in how they think about divine scripture and language? Are they going to keep saying thee and thou in their personal prayers, or using even as an intensifier in their talks? Are they going to stop using KJV language as the language of religion, in other words? I don't know, but I think it's going to be interesting to watch. At the risk of sharing one more anecdote from my personal experience, when I was an undergrad student at Brigham Young University, I was an English major, and one of my favorite courses was the Bible as Literature. It was phenomenal, and it was taught by Dr. Eric Eliason in the English department, who was great. And one of the things I loved in that course was that he required us to read other translations of the Bible, recognizing both the literary legacy and impact of the KJV, as well as its official status within the LDS tradition, but also encouraging us to explore in these other translations. And I found that very useful, and thankful to that class. Thanks to that class, I have several shelves filled with different biblical translations that I used in my own personal study. By the way, if you are interested in picking up another Bible translation to help in your study, whether you're LDS or not, I think the NRSV is the best, or the NRSVUE, the updated edition, which has some revisions from the last few years that I strongly recommend. You can find all of that translation online. But I also strongly recommend getting a physical study book that has the supplementary materials, the footnotes, that allows you to better understand the world of the Bible. And so I have two recommendations. The best text for just general readers is the HarperCollins Study Bible. This uses the NRSV. It's written in a way that will be approachable or usable from you, even if you're not a over-specialized nerd or you don't have much background. It's really, and if you want to go much deeper, the best scholarly work I strongly recommend is the Oxford Annotated Bible. This one's a bit older. This is just the 3rd edition. I bought this for my BYU class. There are more recent editions, and if you want to do a deeper dive, that's where to go. If you want to know more about how Latter-day Saints came to embrace the KJV as not just the common Bible, but the exclusive Bible, There's a wonderful article written by one of the Mormon studies field's best scholars, Philip Barlow. It's titled Why the King James Version, From the Common to the Official Bible of Mormonism. It was published in Dialogue Journal Mormon Thought a few decades ago. Phil Barlow also wrote a wonderful book on the topic titled Mormons and the Bible, published by Oxford University Press in the early 1990s. I think this story of how Latter-day Saints came to embrace the KJV and now softening that embrace of the KJV is fascinating, not just for its own sake, because it tells us a lot more about how Latter-day Saints approach Scripture, change their institutional priorities and interpretations, and also how they are influenced by the broader community, and if Latter-day Saints are fitting into the broader Christian culture. Seeing how they approach Christendom's central text, the Bible, tells us a lot. So I hope this video was useful. If so, hit the like button, share it with others so we can broaden the conversation. If you enjoy this nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed. And if you want to give back, you can become a member. History has never been more relevant than it is right now, in part because it helps us understand why what might appear to be subtle changes, like the exclusivity of the KJV and the LDS tradition, actually means a lot more.
Hi everybody, this is only my second video, but I thought I'd respond to something that's been making the rounds in the debates between a lot of religious scholars, and those are the arguments of Bart Ehrman. Now they're really fascinating and I dove into them deeply. First I'm going to give you a little bit of background myself, and then I'm going to talk about the arguments of Bart Ehrman and why I dislike them. The one thing that you should know is in this video, what I'm going to use as my evidence is not the New Testament. So we're going to take the New Testament and we're going to essentially throw it out entirely. And we're only going to look at historical sources outside of the New Testament to debunk Bart Ehrman. All right, so first of all, a little bit of context about me. I am a university professor. I'm a manuscript reviewer. I'm an editor for several journals. I've reviewed probably between 500 to 1,000 different manuscripts over the last few years. I've also published about 50 manuscripts in the peer-reviewed literature, most of them as first author. Now, I should say that I am not a biblical scholar. I'm also not a historical scholar. So the arguments that I'm going to be making in this video are from more of a really an amateur perspective. So you should really only take these as amateur arguments and just do your own research. So my critiques of Bart Ehrman are not based on any kind of theological ground or philosophical ground. They're really just based on my experience as a researcher. All right, so that's a little bit of background about me. University professor, reviewed a lot of manuscripts, amateurish interest in the statements of Bart Ehrman. Let's now talk briefly about the statements of Bart Ehrman, why they've been gathering a lot of attention, and why they're kind of interesting to dive into. So he makes a lot of different statements. He's essentially an atheistic scholar in his historical perspective, so a lot of what he does is debunk Christianity. But what I'm more interested in is a specific body of writing that he's done about the life of Jesus, which I find to be very interesting from an academic perspective. I have an amateurish interest in the historicity of Jesus, and I like specifically looking at antagonistic sources about Jesus. So Bart Ehrman makes essentially 3 points about Jesus. Number one, he makes the point that Jesus never claimed to be divine during his own lifetime. Now, that's based on his reading of the New Testament. And we'll dive a little more into that, but basically Bart Ehrman's main thesis is that the theology around Jesus was an evolution of later Christianity, and essentially his main point is that Jesus never said he was divine. Second point that Bart Ehrman makes is that Jesus was executed indeed, and he was crucified, but he was probably crucified for political reasons and not religious reasons. The third point that Ehrman makes, which is kind of interesting, is again, I'm distilling some of his points from a lot of his different writings, but the third point that he makes is he posits that the New Testament is essentially an apologetic book towards the Romans. So he states that, or he strongly implies that the idea behind the New Testament is so that the early Christians would essentially gain a little favor with the Romans. Their purpose was to say, hey, look, we're being attacked by the Jews, not by the Romans, and we don't have any ill will towards the Romans, and that maybe this was an effort of early Christians to gain a little bit of favor with the Romans. So that's a very brief and terse distillation of three of Bart Ehrman's more interesting arguments about the historicity of Jesus. And specifically, those are the three arguments that we'll be addressing in this video. Now, I assume if you're watching this video, two things. Number one, I assume that you're already sort of familiar with the writings of Bart Ehrman, so I'm not going to use a lot of direct quotes from him. Number two, I assume that you already are familiar with the counter arguments against Bart Ehrman. Now, when I've reviewed those counter arguments, I find some of them to be persuasive, but as you probably already know, almost all of those arguments are based on the New Testament. So what we're going to do for this video is we're going to throw the New Testament out completely, okay? So we're not going to use any evidence from the New Testament to disprove Bart Ehrman. Now, the one thing that we have to sort of include from the New Testament comes from Bart Ehrman's own analysis, which is that there was a sign above Jesus' head that says King of the Jews. That's an important point to Bart Ehrman because that's the justification that he uses for proving that the death of Jesus was indeed political and was not religiously motivated. So we can go ahead and admit that into evidence. But otherwise, none of this video's evidence is going to be invoking the New Testament at all. And the reason why I'm doing that is just because you are probably already familiar with all of the New Testament evidence debunking Bart Ehrman. You're probably familiar with the Christian apologetic perspective. So what we're going to try to do in this video is use more of a historical antagonistic perspective about the historicity of Jesus to debunk Bart Ehrman's claims, because I think that'll be more intellectually enriching. Now, I should say that if you're watching this video from a Christian perspective, that I hope that none of this portrayal is offensive at all. If you're watching this video as an atheist, I hope you find it interesting. My intention is really to strengthen the academic literature around the historicity of Jesus. And in this video in particular, it is not to sort of cast a pejorative light on anyone, so respect to Bart Ehrman, respect to all the historical researchers out there, and respect to even those of you who are maybe spiritually or religiously already have a set of beliefs that you ascribe to that you don't want shaken. This is not going to be a video that touches on anything that is, I think, spiritually or religiously contentious, and my perspective is purely to sort of incorporate a more academic perspective on the historicity of Jesus by looking at antagonistic sources. All right, so the first antagonistic source that I'll talk about just briefly is a book called The Toledot Yeshu. This is really not just one book. It's essentially a list of about 8 different variants of the same book, which is the Jewish Anti-Jesus Polemic. Now, this is a very interesting set of books. There's actually hundreds of different variants. There's 8 major versions. I've made a separate video about this book, and the one thing that you need to know about this book is it is essentially the Jewish refutation or disputation of Jesus. So this book is based on the reasons why the Jews said Jesus was, a false blasphemer, a heretic. So what are the things in the Toledot Yeshu that we can glean that are more likely to be true? Well, what I try to use in my other video that I make about the Toledot Yeshu is a minimal synthetic approach. So saying there's 8 different versions. What are the things that are common to all 8 different versions of the Toledot Yeshu? And if we have something that's common to all of the versions, it's a little more likely that we can say that those statements are reliably true if they resonate through all 8 versions. Now, by the way, briefly, it's probably important to let you know what the age of the Toledot Yeshu is for purposes of this video. Most of the copies that we have are sort of medieval in origin, so I would say starting in about the maybe 5th or 6th century all the way up to the 15th century. Those are the copies that we have. But the Toledot Yeshu is based on earlier oral teachings, so it was probably written, or at least originally taught, as early as the 2nd or 3rd century, and the versions in writing that we have are later than that. But we know, because there were 8 different versions from medieval times at least, that the tradition of the Toledot Yeshu and the oral teachings on which it's based are in fact much earlier than that. So here are just some quotes from some of the different versions of the Toledot Yeshu that endorse that Jesus did indeed initially claim to be divine from the outset. So from the Aramaic or Haldreich version of the Toledot Yeshu, which we have from the 9th and 11th century, Yeshu said to them, I am the Son of God. I was born of a virgin. I will ascend to heaven and sit at the right hand of my Father. From the Wagon Cell version, it states that he, Jesus, claimed to be God and led the people astray. Let his name be blotted out. That's referring to the name of Jesus, so this says clearly he claimed to be God. The Halkin recension, which is the Hebrew version that I've talked about in my other video, says that Jesus said, by this name, the name of God, I will ascend to heaven as befits the Son of God. So again, claiming to be the Son of God.
At the risk of sharing one...
Maybe I'll just read one more version, which is the Western version of the Toledot Yeshu, where it says, he claimed, that's referring to Jesus before the people, I am the light of the world, and no one comes to the Father but through me. Again, this was not the Jews saying, yes, this guy was correct in his claim of divinity. This is just the Jews saying, sort of mockingly, that Jesus was claiming to be divine, and obviously this was erroneous. So the Toledot Yeshu does go into several reasons why these were erroneous statements from Jesus, but the claim of divinity is again endorsed by all 8 versions of the Toledot Yeshu. Now, the next main argument against Bart Ehrman's thesis comes also from the early Jews. It's from Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, who was a prominent rabbinic sage in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And Rabbi Eliezer was regarded as a great rabbi. A lot of his teachings are recorded in a book called the Tosefta. If you're not familiar with this book, it's essentially the Jewish oral teaching record, so it's like the Mishnah. So this is sort of considered a canonical source of Jewish teaching, so it's, the sort of canonical interpretation of the Bible. So anyways, the Tosefta, in it, Rabbi Eliezer refers to Jesus as a min, M-I-N, which is a word that sort of means heretic. But this word specifically refers to someone with divine pretensions. So it can be either unauthorized access to God's power or somebody who blasphemes against God. So that's clearly a very early recollection from something as early as around 70 AD, so within a few decades of Jesus, saying that indeed Jesus was known widely at that time to be someone who blasphemed, somebody who had divine pretensions, and somebody who had unauthorized, or someone who had unauthorized access to the power of God. So that is Rabbi Eliezer's testimony from as early as 70 AD, and he cites essentially what is an earlier teaching about Jesus. So we know that from the Jews' perspective, in the early decades after Jesus, it was well and widely understood that indeed Jesus had pretenses of divinity and was leading Israel astray for that reason. Now there's also the Talmudic testimony, the Talmud directly. This is from between the 2nd and 5th centuries, but again, it preserves an earlier oral tradition, possibly from the 1st or 2nd century. So we can date most of what the Talmud says to probably the 1st or 2nd century. Now, in this book, it said that Jesus was executed on the eve of Passover for the crimes of sorcery and leading Israel astray. Now, the specific word that the Talmud uses here is hisit. I won't try to pronounce the entire Hebrew phrase for what Jesus did, but the word that they use specifically is hisit. I'll put the whole phrase in the video, but this legal category of hisit applies to people who claim to be divine, or people who lead the Jews to worship idols falsely. So false idolatry falls under this category. Inciting false idolatry falls under this category. Claims of divinity directly also fall under this category. So again, this is the Talmud from Sanhedrin 43a, which verifies that Jesus did have pretensions of divinity. Another set of teachings we can look at is the Sanhedrin 107b, the Soda 47a, which depicts Jesus as turning to idolatry, learning magic, being rejected by other rabbinical teachers. And this writing about Jesus says specifically that there was a misuse of a divine claim by Jesus. So this essentially says that Jesus did make a divine claim which was misused and erroneous. Again, these are all pejorative writings about Jesus. These are all writings intended to negate Jesus, but they all sort of coalesce around the point that Jesus claimed to be divine, at least at some point. And this writing is very early as well, from the 3rd or 5th century, and again preserves an earlier teaching about Jesus. So far, we've just talked about the Jewish writings against Jesus. It's probably very relevant for me to point out that I hope that no one takes away from this video that this is a statement that should incite any anti-Semitism or any sentiment against the Jews at all. I'm merely looking at the early Jewish teachings about Jesus for the purpose of asking a question about the historicity of Jesus, which is, did Jesus claim to be divine? All right, so far we've just looked at Jewish sources. Let's now switch gears. We're going to turn our attention and look at Roman and pagan sources that also claim that Jesus was essentially a pretender to divinity. We can start with Celsus. He was maybe one of the earliest prolific critics of the early Christian movement. He was writing in about 170 AD, and Celsus refers to Jesus as a magician, somebody who gathered disreputable followers, and somebody who claimed divinity. Celsus specifically states in a work that cites him as he proclaimed himself to be God. So here we have an unequivocal testimony early on from Celsus in the mid-2nd century where he says Jesus proclaimed himself to be God. We can also look at Tacitus. Now, this is a bit of an interesting set of writings by Tacitus, but he was writing a little bit earlier, and in his book called Annals in 116 AD, he refers to Christianity as a mischievous superstition. Now, the crime that he ascribes to Jesus is the crime of superstitio. And again, I'll put the full Roman term in the video so that I don't have to pronounce it. But so now this crime refers to something that's very specific, which is unauthorized religious devotion of a new deity. So in this writing, Tacitus is actually endorsing that Jesus was encouraging the religious devotion to a new deity, and that was Jesus' crime. So here we have a very early recording in 116 AD saying that yes, indeed, Jesus did claim to be divine. Porphyry is another writer who gets often cited. He's a little bit later, writing in about 270 AD. He also endorses that Jesus claimed to be divine. He denies the validity of this claim. Obviously, he's a critic of the Christians, but he critiques the Christians as worshiping Jesus as God, which shows that the Christian worship of Jesus as God was a very early thing that happened. And he also agrees that Jesus presented himself on his own to be divine, and he denies the validity, saying that Jesus was killed by the Roman authorities appropriately in the terms of Porphyry because he was claiming to be divine. So that's another statement from somebody very early on who endorses that Jesus did indeed claim to be divine. We can look at a few other early critics like Lucian of Samosata. He satirically describes Christianity, so he's somebody who's ridiculing Christianity, writing between 160 to 180 AD or CE, if you like. And he says that the early Christians were denying the pagan gods and worshiping instead someone who presented himself as a divine figure. So he reflects also the early on Greco-Roman perception that Jesus was presented as a deified figure both by himself and also by early Christians. Now, another argument that I'll invoke here is it's interesting to note that the argumentation that Jesus did not present himself as divine really starts with the 14th century in the Gospel of Barnabas, which was an apocryphal gospel. I won't go into a lot of details about it, but it's now well known to be a historically inauthentic work. It's interesting to me that it's only more recently that we've sort of resurrected this argument that Jesus never claimed to be divine. But to me, as an amateur historical scholar and an amateur person with interest in the historicity of Jesus, that the arguments about Jesus' claim to be divine surface now in modern times and much later. So for me, arguments that are earlier sort of inherently carry a lot more weight, especially because we have so many of them and they're all so congruent with each other. So that's sort of one of the big issues that I have. Anyone who really tries to recontextualize or redefine what Jesus said or did, we're looking through a lens of a lot of history. And I think, if we come up with a new statement or a new conclusion about Jesus, it really should be weighed against the older arguments that we have and the older analysis that we have. All right, so let's talk about one other argument that disproves Bart Ehrman's logic. And that is the problem of all the other early Jewish figures who claimed to be the leaders of the Jews and who led revolts against the Romans, who were not treated as heretics or blasphemers by the Jews. There's three major figures early on that come to mind. One is, I'm probably mispronouncing some of these names, but one is Simon Bar Kokhba in 135 AD. He led a revolt against the Romans. He was not reviled or hated by the Jews. There's no anti-Simon Bar Kokhba literature. So he was not vilified. He was not viewed as a heretic. Judas the Galilean in 6 AD and Theudas in the 40s AD also led uprisings against the Romans. They were never accused of apostasy. They were never accused by the Jews of having any divine pretensions. They were not accused by the Jews to be heretics. They were not accused of being blasphemers. So, in other words, there were leaders of the Jews, or people who were self-appointed leaders, who were not viewed as heretics or blasphemers before and also after Jesus, and in a time frame which is very contemporary to Jesus. So very early before Jesus, very close in proximity to the time of Jesus, and very close in proximity after the time of Jesus. So that to me means that there must have been something different about Jesus. So there must have been some statement that Jesus made, or some collection of statements that Jesus made, that caused the Jews at the time to be much more upset with Jesus than they were with these other leaders. So this is one area where Bart Ehrman's analysis breaks down. Another important consideration for the breakdown of Bart Ehrman's analysis is that it does rely heavily on the argument that crucifixion is specifically something that is reserved for political prisoners. So Bart Ehrman's analysis concludes that because Jesus was crucified, that's strong evidence that Jesus was a political figure and was not indeed a religious or spiritual figure. So let's now critically take a look at that argument itself. Again, this argument is not supported by the historical literature that we know about. We have many historians on several different sides of the religious and historical perspective who all endorse that crucifixion was more widely used as a punishment and was not just reserved for political ideologues specifically. You can look at Suetonius, who describes crucifixion for slaves and also for common criminals. You can look at Seneca, who writes that crucifixions are common. They're used for citizens and specifically, they're used for, criminals, and specifically also used for non-citizens. You can look at the writings of Cicero, refers to crucifixion being commonly used for slaves. Anyone who is sort of a freed slave or a slave who escaped their slavery was considered an especially egregious threat. Highway robbers and bandits were also crucified. They were also described to be threats. Josephus is also someone who describes mass crucifixions of Jewish civilians during the siege of Jerusalem just to prove a point, to quash a rebellion. There were slaves that were crucified. There were bandits. There were pirates who were also crucified. So there are several examples of crucifixion being used for crimes other than pretending to be a political leader. It's probably worth briefly mentioning that there are early Christian sources that talk about the context of crucifixion as something that is reserved for lowly criminals. But again, in this video, for purposes of this video, we can just throw those all out the window. If you want, you can look them up. Justin Martyr, Tertullian say that crucifixion was more widely used, but I think the purpose of this video is to more focus on antagonistic literature. All right, finally, we're going to look at three flaws in Bart Ehrman's analysis directly that are logical flaws that I think are just internal to the argumentation that he makes. Now, the first big flaw, we've talked about several, which, the problems with saying that crucifixion is just reserved for political leaders. But the other problem is he does not, in his own analysis, present Jesus as a convincing political leader. In other words, what was Jesus' political platform? What was his statement? What statements did he make against the Romans? There's no real evidence that Jesus took any kind of unique stance against the Romans. And Ehrman's own analysis doesn't really endorse that Jesus was a political ideologue, that he had a social platform, that he had a political platform, that he was advocating for any political change or any specific political revolution. So that, I think, is a major gap in Ehrman's analysis. The other major gap in Ehrman's analysis, which I think is one of the main points of this video, is that he argues that Jesus' body was discarded and the hallucinations, and that the reason why people perceived Jesus to be resurrected were because of hallucinations. Now, this is a fascinating point. Other thinkers and other psychologists and other multidisciplinary analyses have come out to say, yes, the resurrection of Jesus was an apparent hallucination, or no, it wasn't, or no, it couldn't have been. My field of expertise is more aligned with the medical field, so I would argue that there's not enough evidence that Jesus' resurrection was merely a hallucination. But my point here is not to make that argument. My point is to say that Ehrman's analysis on that point is really inconclusive and incomplete. And the problem is that he invokes that step in his logic as a major important chain in his analysis. So unfortunately, he has a huge chain in his analysis, which is very, very weak, which breaks down upon further inspection. I think if Ehrman wanted to make the case that Jesus' apparent resurrection was definitely a hallucination, his analysis should have been more multidisciplinary, or he should have brought in other people in some other way to support his thinking. And the reason why this is important is because this is where Ehrman would probably make the distinction between Jesus and other leaders who were not reviled by the Jews. He would say that, well, the problem was that there was this perceived resurrection episode that happened, and that's why the Jews specifically reviled Jesus. But the problem is his explanation for why there was a perceived resurrection breaks down. And so there is a big gap in his logical analysis. The other problem that Ehrman creates in his own analysis internally is one of the major steps in the sort of mechanistic causality of Ehrman's conjecture of the history at the time is that Jesus' body was discarded. And he says that specifically to sort of accept his bigger picture analysis of what happened with Jesus, you have to sort of accept that Jesus' body was discarded. Now, the problem is, again, I won't go into a whole lot of detail about this, but the first problem with this is that Ehrman doesn't offer any supportive analysis on this point. The second problem with this is that it does contradict, again, a mountain of Jewish literature. For example, just off the top of my head, all 8 different versions of the Toledot Yeshu say that Jesus' body disappeared for a time. Now, the Jews are not endorsing that Jesus was resurrected. In fact, their argument that Jesus' body disappeared was based on their account that his disciples stole his body. That's in some different variations. Or the argument that the gardener stole the body. That's in some other variations. But the Jews very specifically believed that the body disappeared. It was unaccounted for a while. It was removed from a tomb, according to every version of the Toledot Yeshu. It not only disappeared, but was moved from a tomb. And although the Jews explain this, Bart Ehrman's analysis runs contrary to this. So you have yet another example of a situation where it's a major causal link in Ehrman's analysis, and he doesn't support it at all. And in fact, he argues something that's counter to the accepted historical narrative by other sources, including antagonistic sources. All right, so that brings this video to a close. I don't want to go on too much longer, but I do want to underscore what is the main point of this video. Why am I making a video debunking Bart Ehrman? The reason is this. There is, I think, a fairly large problem in the atheist community, which is that most of the major atheist thinkers come to a scientific, scholarly, philosophically analytical perspective but they do so with the first step of their journey being made through an anti-theistic framework. So if you look at Bart Ehrman, he sort of typifies this. So he went into Christian studies, he went into New Testament scholarship after he became an atheist. He was in seminary, he pursued a course as a Christian minister, he decided he didn't believe in Jesus anymore, and then he said, I'm going to become a New Testament scholar to disprove the New Testament. Now, I really think that this is problematic. If you're going to study the New Testament as a scholar from a perspective of historical scholarship, you should be more neutral on the New Testament. Unfortunately, I think secular scholarship on the New Testament is beleaguered by how many people go into that field from an initially anti-theistic or atheistic perspective. And I think that's why Bart Ehrman's analysis ultimately suffers. Now, there are only really two other explanations for why Ehrman's analysis would be so flawed. In other words, if I, as a historically amateur scholar, can come up with all these arguments to indicate that Bart Ehrman was wrong, I'm clearly not uncovering new historical research. This is research that would be known to any historical scholar. So the question then becomes, why does Bart Ehrman not reconcile himself with these beliefs? Why does he not talk about the literature, the evidence that he himself must know is out there? This is all commonly known historical scholarship that I'm citing. These are not new ideas that I'm bringing up for the first time ever. And Ehrman does not deal with a lot of this analysis. He doesn't talk about the Jewish literature. He doesn't talk about the early Roman documentation that Jesus claimed to be divine. He doesn't talk about other political leaders who did not claim to be deified in anywhere and did not claim to be divine, and how they were not reviled by the Jews. So the fact that Ehrman doesn't address this is, I think, something that exposes that he has an inherent bias. So I think he's either presenting his research in a way that's disingenuous or in a way that is really incompetent by not including a lot of the other research that's out there. Again, I've heard him lecture. I think he's an intelligent individual, so I'm not putting this conclusion out there to pejorate Bart Ehrman. I'm just saying that there are gaps in his analysis, and they are pretty obvious gaps. All right, well, that concludes this video. Again, I hope I've not said anything offensive to either side in this video. My interest is sort of amateur historical interest in the historicity of Jesus, and I'm happy to take more questions in the comment section. This is one of my first videos, so if you have any thoughts on this video, let me know what you think. If you have any suggestions for things I can tackle next, what do you think? Feel free to put your questions, comments, or suggested topics in the comment section of this video. And lastly, I'd really love to know what your thoughts are on this. After digesting this argument, does this change your mind? Do you think that it's less likely that Jesus claimed to be divine, or do you think it's more likely? Are there other historical sources that I should have cited that I didn't? There are definitely other sources that I came across in my research that I didn't cite in the interest of time. But let me know what you think. Do you think Jesus claimed to be divine? Do you think he didn't claim to be divine? And I'm specifically interested in what your background is. If you're an atheist and you believe that Jesus claimed to be divine, or you believe that Jesus didn't claim to be divine, I'm interested in either side of that. If you're a Christian and you believe that Jesus didn't claim to be divine, that's certainly very interesting, and I'd love to learn more about that as well. So let me know what you think in the comments section, and thanks very much for supporting this video. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning into this video. This is going to be a bit of a different video. I apologize. I know it's going to be longer. I probably won't do as much editing just because of the sheer length of this video, but a lot of you have asked me this question over and over again, and I haven't given you a good enough answer in these videos. So in this video, I'm going to attempt to answer this question. And the question is, why did I go from being a very stubborn atheist who was very strident and frankly very argumentative to being somebody who now believes that Jesus is divine? It's a good question. It's very legitimate. I have some really good answers to this question, and I want to get into some of those answers in this video because I just feel like it's justified that you ask the question, and maybe this is the thing that you have the biggest right to be curious about, and I really do want to explain myself. All right, first, a lot of prefaces, unfortunately. Number one, I apologize for the length of the video. I will try to make my delivery on each point very snappy so that my speech is concise and terse and still gets the point across. All right, number two, this should really be maybe a two-part video series because, you know, my journey was divided sort of in between, do I believe in God first, and then do I believe in Jesus? In this video, I'm just going to talk about the reasons why I came to believe that Jesus is likely divine. And the other preface is that this is really like a 3-part series. So in other words, there are 3 different sort of categories of reasons why I decided that Jesus is likely divine. In this video, I'm going to talk about the philosophical and sort of maybe literary reasons why I decided that Jesus likely represents divine truth. There are sort of 2 other categories. One category is the historical evidence, why the narrative of Jesus seems convincing. And the third category is the scientific evidence, why I was specifically drawn to the theology of the New Testament that Jesus presents. But in this video, I'm going to talk mostly about historical and philosophical and literary reasons. If you want to see more of these videos, please let me know. All right, the next preface is that these aren't necessarily the best reasons. I just thought these would be good reasons that I could fairly tersely explain in the format of a short-form YouTube video. The real journey of my coming to believe that Jesus was likely divine is something that I've written about over the course of 4 books. So I will probably try to put the most relevant book in the discussion section of this video, the description, just so that you all can read more about this if you're interested. All right, now first, before I get into my reasons for believing, I just want to quickly do a plug for the channel. Number 1, we're a new channel. If you like this video, that really does help us out tremendously, much more so because our channel is so new. I would love it if you subscribe to this channel. Please click the bell icon for notifications so that you don't miss out on future videos. And the most important thing to me is just put your comments in the comments section, because this is really intended to be more of a discussion, and I hope that you all will help me keep that discussion moving in the comment section. Almost everyone that I've had this conversation with has come away with, I would say, a more nuanced or a more highly engaged perception of what Jesus means to some people. So I hope that you all come away with that perception as well. All right, first of all, I want to talk about this quick bonus section. These are not the reasons why I started to believe that Jesus is divine or represents divine truth. So these are the reasons that people commonly assume that this is the most, in other words, common assumptions that get made when I tell people that I believe in Jesus. So number 1 is fear of death. Why do I think that I'm not just clinging to religion because I'm afraid of death or because I have existential angst? Well, a few years ago, I was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and I was actually quite content with the understanding that as an atheist, that's what I was at the time, I was very content with the knowledge that, I would die and that would be the end of it. Now, I'm not saying I wasn't afraid of death, but I very much could identify that I was very afraid of the moments leading up to death. Like, I didn't want a painful death, and I just wanted to be very comfortable, and that was my biggest concern. But I was totally comfortable with, I'm dead, that's it, I turn to dust, and that's the end of it. There's no post-death existence of my consciousness. So I really don't have a lot of fear of death. I don't feel like I have any religious angst or existential fears. Second reason, this is not due to any religious upbringing. I was brought up in a very austere religious environment that was not Christian. I then became sort of anti-religious. And again, I was a very strident, argumentative atheist. I was very stubborn. And I was also a very content atheist. So I had no inclination to come back to religion. All right, the next reason, it wasn't because of any social pressures. None of my friends know me as an atheist. My family is not aware of any of this stuff. So this is all stuff there's no social pressures on me to leave atheism and to embrace Jesus. So I've made some new friends since I've been going to a church which is nearby me, but I wouldn't say that there's any social pressure. No one's pressuring me to change my mind. All right, and the final reason that people kind of assume is, I wasn't on drugs. I wasn't desperate for God. God never spoke to me. I didn't have that sort of transformative or transcendental experience that a lot of people have. I don't know why that is. I think it's just because I just wasn't. I'm a very analytical, logical, pensive, over-intellectualizing person. I don't tend to have a lot of transcendental emotional experiences anyways. Maybe that's the reason why. All right, and now we'll get into the reasons why. So these are kind of more positive reasons why I decided to believe that Jesus represents divine truth. The first reason is because Jesus was from a very humble origin, but had a very cohesive moral philosophy that was all together, like sort of so cohesively baked together that it's just very impressive. And it just seemed very almost eerie to me that Jesus had such an advanced set of ideas. And on the other hand, Jesus was from such a simple, humble background from everything that we know and everything we know about Jesus from the historical literature. All right, so, almost every historical scholar admits that Jesus was probably the most influential person in history, if not at least one of the most influential people in history. Now, despite this, he wasn't a king. He didn't have a legacy. He didn't have any army behind him. He left no inheritance. it doesn't seem like he came from an especially wealthy or well-to-do family. So the fact that somebody so humble from sort of a fairly mundane background made such an impact is alone something that was impressive to me. And it's something that I was like, well, I should learn more about this person. I should dive into him more thoroughly. The fact that he had such a cohesive and advanced moral philosophy from such a humble origin is also alone by itself very, very impressive. You know, if you read quotes about Jesus from Leo Tolstoy, Gandhi, and many other thinkers, many other philosophers throughout history, there is sort of an acknowledgement that what Jesus had is a very impressive philosophy. We'll get into that philosophy in the next point, so I don't want to spoil that too much. But it's almost eerie that somebody so humble would be so admired and would become such a philosophical genius, almost so much so that there are very few people in history who have risen to that level. Especially with the fact that from everything we know about Jesus, he probably wasn't particularly educated. He didn't turn to the Roman intellectual circles, which did exist at the time. He had his own moral philosophy that was very iconoclastic, that there's no proto ethos of Jesus that we find elsewhere in the ancient literature. So that to me was very interesting and almost eerie. Another thing that's sort of eerie about Jesus is the degree to which his teachings were very, very prescient of what would happen with later Christianity. And, I can tell you more about this because, I went through medical school, and a lot of what you do in medical school is you learn sort of parables and mnemonic devices so that you can remember information. So like there's different devices that you can use to remember things. And when you're memorizing different, the facial nerves are, there's a mnemonic device that's like a little narrative story. And each word in that story is like, the different nerve parts of your facial nerve. And I'm not going to go into that too much because it's probably not that interesting to anyone. But it is just very eerie to me that as I was reading the New Testament, it was obviously and immediately apparent to me that Jesus doesn't care about the people he's talking to learning the lessons that he has to teach. What he cares about is, are they going to remember those lessons for a long time? Now, that's really very interesting to me because if you talk to people, we don't talk to each other that way. If I have a conversation with someone, I'm just trying to convince that person in that conversation. So if my teaching gets to them, that's usually sort of the end of the thinking process for me. It was to me almost eerie that Jesus had the prescience to say, I'm talking to people who aren't going to be able to write down this information for a long time, so I better make it very memorable. And that's why Jesus speaks in, parables. I've read the formative texts of the Sikh religion and of the Baha'i faith very extensively. I was very interested in those religions. And to me, it's just, I can't really quote a lot of those teachings. I can tell you about them and I can kind of describe them. But to me, the degree to which I can quote New Testament teachings is so much more articulate. And the reason for that is because they're so mnemonic. And that was to me just kind of almost eerie. If you read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus actually uses a technique called alliteration where he, every word starts with the same consonant to make it more memorable. I just find that very, very interesting, and it's very prescient, and you don't find that in a lot of other religion origin stories. All right, and again, I'm not going to get too much into the history, but I do want to emphasize under this point that even early Christianity is very impressive and defies expectations in a lot of ways. First of all, it was dramatically energized by the loss of its figurehead. If you look at any modern cult or any religion throughout history, almost every time the primary leader of that cult or that movement dies, almost every time there's a period of recontextualization, right? So the next leader who comes up will sort of reinterpret and recontextualize those teachings. And, often those teachings will be slightly modified. But even like Peter, Paul, and all the other early church leaders were tremendously just deferential to Jesus. They always deferred to Jesus. There was no interest in exalting themselves. And there was definitely no interest in sort of expropriating the teachings of Jesus and reinterpreting them so that they would exist in a new way or under a new context. I find that really, really very, very interesting. And it really defies expectations. If you look at, we'll talk about Marxism, communism later, but it just defies expectations that happened with Christianity. And Christianity does continue to move throughout the world in a very iconoclastic way. And I'll just give you one example because this is not going to be super emphasizing all the history of Christianity. But Christianity is by far the most ethnically diverse religion. I've talked about that in other videos, so I won't go through all the statistics here in this video. But Christianity has, on every inhabited continent, Christianity has a strong indigenous base. And that to me is in and of itself really fascinating. You can go to Africa and find Christians. You can go to Asia and find Christians. So every continent, there is an indigenous Christian movement. I find that really, or what I should say is, a Christian movement among indigenous people. That's very iconoclastic. That doesn't exist in a lot of other religions. Now, let's look at counterexamples for Jesus. So we can look at other people who were very influential throughout history. One counterexample that people often bring up is the Prophet Muhammad, who, but if you look at Muhammad, it's very different. He eventually commanded an army. He was practicing for about 6 decades. And after his death, his school of thought was really recontextualized, reinterpreted, and the caliphates several times over, who then took over the Muslim faith, really reevaluated that faith in a lot of different ways and recontextualized it and redefined it. I'll just give you just one example. In 650, Caliph Uthman took all the copies of the Quran at the time and destroyed all the other copies other than his own. So there was a purging and saying like, okay, now my document is now the formative document. That doesn't really happen in Christianity. Let's look at the counterexample of Marxism. I think that's another interesting counterexample to bring up. So Marxism, like Karl Marx, was a really great writer. I really like a lot of things that he wrote, and he gets kind of labeled in a certain way in the North American political discourse. But Karl Marx had a lot of really valuable statements. But he got a lot of his philosophy from Hegel. And then in turn, Marxism got reinterpreted as Leninism, and then that got reinterpreted again as Stalinism. So you see this period of sort of iterative recontextualization with each primary leader when you look at Marxism and its evolution into communism. That doesn't really happen with Christianity. I know there's different sects and there's different people who have, interpreted Christianity very differently, but there's always a degree of deferentialness to Jesus that I just don't feel like that exists in other intellectual movements. Moreover, almost every other intellectual movement in history is based on some preceding intellectual movement, and then a revolution happens when it's reinterpreted. You don't see that with Jesus. In other words, there's not like an intellectual lineage or heritage that Jesus got that Jesus then recreated. He really creates a system of ideas, a system of philosophies, a system of theologies that is very monolithic. It's kind of like created together, and he presents it in a very unified and holistic way all at once. That's very advanced, and it just seems very surprising that Jesus would do that. All right, the next reason that I have is I actually like the philosophies and theologies of Jesus. Now, this is not wish fulfillment, so I do want to preempt that argument, but we'll get into a thought experiment that I'll discuss later in this reason. But just assume for now at this point in the discussion until I make this argument in a different way later in this contention, assume for a moment that the most beautiful truths are the truths that are most likely to be true from a religious perspective. So, all right. So with that, let's get into why I like the morality of Jesus and why I like the theology of Jesus. So I've written a lot about this. Probably the most relevant book where I read a lot about this is Radical Jesus. Maybe I'll put a link in the discussion section. But the 3 ideas that I really like of Jesus, which I think are very nuanced and very interesting and very advanced, are humility, love, and forgiveness. Now, the other really interesting thing about the New Testament is most New Testament scholars agree that humility, love, and forgiveness are the 3 values and core teachings of Jesus that do come up again and again in a very iterative way. But what's really interesting about these 3 teachings is that they're each sort of analogized and exemplified by the different 3 components of the Trinity. So if you look at Jesus the Son, that's sort of an embodiment of humility, and Jesus is likened to very humble animals. A lot of people describe Jesus as humble. By the way, that in and of itself is very, very iconoclastic. I have not found any other religion in the world where the deity is described in such a humble way. So Jesus, humility, that kind of goes together. The second teaching is love. The teaching of love seems to be analogized and exemplified by the Holy Ghost in a lot of different ways. And then there's the teaching of forgiveness. Forgiveness seems to be exemplified and analogized by God the Father, or what I like to call the parent God in my books. So the parent God sort of analogizes forgiveness. And then here's another really interesting thing about the New Testament. So we've talked about the 3 core lessons and the 3 entities of the Trinity that analogize and exemplify those core lessons. And also you can actually construct a different moral triangle that kind of goes along with these, which is, to me, very interesting. There's sort of self interactions. So how do you regard yourself? Self-other interactions. So how do you interact with other people? And then self-God interactions. So the fact that Jesus' theology accounts for 3 points of 3 different circles, 3 different triangles, is very, very interesting. So the self interactions are sort of the story of humility, and there's a lot of lessons from Jesus himself. The self-other interactions are the way Jesus interacts with his following, which he kind of hands off to the Holy Ghost. That's sort of analogous of love. And then there's the self-God interactions, and that's all about forgiveness. That's about the Father or the parent God. And so you have 3 triangles that really align in a really beautiful way in the theology of Jesus. I just think that's really amazing and very insightful and very and it makes sense so well. I've written about this in Radical Jesus, and I get into some wacky sort of geometric explanations for this. Like I talk about the Platonic solids because a tetrahedron is made of 3 different triangles, and that's the very simplest Platonic solid. And then I talk about the philosophies of Pythagoras. So I go in some sort of wacky directions, but a terse distillation, I think, of this argument still gets the point across. All right, now, again, there's not like a proto-gospel that Jesus borrows this stuff from. There's not a set of teachings that Jesus learned these ideas from. I got super into ancient Egyptian teachings because I was kind of reading them voraciously because I was trying to come up with like, well, did Jesus borrow these ideas from other people and then bring them to Judea? And I really don't think he did. I can't really find anything similar. All right, now here's why this matters and why this is not wish fulfillment. The reason is because if you're evaluating religious truths, the most beautiful truths or the most impressive truths ought to be the ones that are most likely to be valid, right? No, just to like sort of argue this to a greater degree, let's consider a thought experiment. Let's imagine that there's a God, that there's a bunch of religions, and religion B is less beautiful than religion A, and religion C is less beautiful than religion B. And let's say you follow religion A, and then you die, and you get evaluated by God after you're dead. And you're saying, well, here's everything that I learned. Here's how beautiful it is. There's not really a retort to that after you're dead. In other words, God's not going to come back and say, yeah, that would have been really cool if that had been the case, but it's not. And, we're going to go with this less beautiful, less interesting, less intellectually fulfilling way of perceiving the universe. I just don't think that's like, unless God is a very anthropomorphic being, that just seems very unlikely. So if you kind of consider what I consider, which is a very broad conceptualization of God and maybe the consciousness within the universe and the consciousness beyond the universe, I think it's likely that the most beautiful truths are the truths that are the most likely to be true, most likely to be valid. Now, again, let's look at some counterexamples of different moral philosophies because I think it's worth contrasting Jesus with other trends in moral philosophy just to underscore the beauty of Jesus. All right, so my favorite book as a kid growing up was this 1785 book by Immanuel Kant, Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. It's a really great work. It's where Immanuel Kant comes up with the categorical imperative. I read several of Kant's books several times, and I thought they were really very, very interesting. But if you kind of think about it, this work is a little bit incomplete because it's sort of one-dimensional. In other words, it's really just how you sort of react to a moral action. The categorical imperative, for those who don't know, is essentially a more philosophically grounded recapitulation of the golden rule. So to me, the golden rule is important. It's foundational for morality, but it's really sort of one-dimensional. In other words, it really only determines how we should interact with others. So those other components of self-interactions, humility, and the other components of the theology of Jesus are not really in the categorical imperative in that kind of an advanced way. Another thing that I sort of learned as I grew up is, the golden rule is again very important, very interesting, very foundational to morality. But if you look at bonobos, which is essentially a type of a different species of chimpanzee, bonobos have an understanding of morality as well, and they also have an understanding of the golden rule. So to me, I was like, great, Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest thinkers in history, came up with this morality, but in coming up with this morality, he proved that it takes a lot of thought, and you're still at essentially the level of a bonobo. So that to me is very interesting. All right, let's look at another counterexample. This is going to be controversial, but another counterexample is the Ten Commandments. So to me, the Ten Commandments are good moral rules, okay? But they're sort of incomplete because they don't explain what happens when you fall short of achieving those values. So I think one of the nice things about Jesus is he's like, these are the Ten Commandments. These are the degree to which you can optimize the Ten Commandments. In other words, this is like a star that you're shooting for if you follow the Ten Commandments. And I think Jesus goes into that really in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus, which is maybe, by the way, the most important single lecture on morality in history. But in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, the Ten Commandments aren't something that you do or don't do. They're something that you can sort of pursue for all your life, and you'll never really hit that moral apogee. So what I like about Jesus is he takes the Ten Commandments, he contextualizes them as an apogee of human moral achievement, and he also at the same time says, this is what happens is if you fall short, then there's a pathway for forgiveness, and that's the doctrine of forgiveness and the theology of forgiveness that Jesus teaches. So I think that's, the Ten Commandments make a counterexample for the validity of Jesus' teachings. One last counterexample is Buddhism. I think Buddhism is a great moral meditational practice. Traditional Buddhism actually holds that the Buddha was not himself divine. So, in other words, I have a lot of respect for Buddhism as a meditational practice. I think it's a good way to move past and mitigate your own understanding of your own wants. But Buddhism is not as complete a moral philosophy. It's a pathway to move towards enlightenment, but it's not a way of interrelating with the God of the universe. It's also not really a way of interrelating with others. In other words, in Buddhism, it's important to forgive others, and Buddhism does emphasize forgiving in a very beautiful way. But you're really only supposed to forgive others insofar as it moves you closer to enlightenment. So the Buddha gives the pursuit of enlightenment as the justification for why you should forgive others. I think it's really interesting that Jesus is depicting a very, very different view of forgiveness. In Jesus' view, forgiveness is really much more fascinating and much more nuanced, and I think more beautiful for a few different reasons. In some ways, when somebody does something bad to me, what I usually say is, don't worry about it, no big deal. Somebody recently did something that was pretty bad to me, and that was my acceptance of their apology. I was like, hey, don't worry about it, water under the bridge, it's no big deal. Jesus is definitely not saying that. Jesus is saying, your sins are a big deal. Those sins form the millstone of the weight that crushed me down when I was on the cross. So it is a big deal that you sin, but I can take that because I believe in you. And to me, that's a very different statement. When's the last time you forgave somebody and you said, I'm not forgiving you because this is not a big deal. I'm forgiving you because I believe in you, because I know that you can do better. That to me is a much more profound, more satisfying, and more beautiful way of forgiving somebody. And in some ways, the forgiveness that Jesus offers through God is even a quantum level above that, because that's essentially what Jesus is saying is God forgives you. God knows every single particle of your being. He knows you down to the quantum level, to the subatomic level, in the molecular level. Like, God knows every particle of your being. And knowing you better than anyone in the universe could ever possibly know you, better than, and infinitely better than you could even know yourself. God is saying, I know you this well, and I believe that you are worthy of forgiveness. That to me is a really beautiful thought. I just want to close this reason with one other thing that I didn't include, which is just, I do want to underscore the beauty of Jesus' teachings of love, humility, and forgiveness in a different way, and that they all sort of potentiate each other and they all counterbalance each other. Again, I'm sorry that this video is getting so long, but I think that's an important realization. I do write about that in Radical Jesus. And let me just give you one example of that. So humility is emphasized in a lot of religions. A lot of religions are like, God is awesome and you should humble yourself before God. But Jesus offers a very different, much more nuanced perspective on humility. He says you should be humble like a child, and you shouldn't be so humble, so self-effacing, so self-denigrating that you reach a point that you dislike yourself. I think this is one way that a lot of other religions miss the mark. Jesus' humility is not like keeping humble, and just pursue humility, endlessly. Jesus is saying your humility should be counterbalanced by love. In other words, you should be humble, but you should realize that God still loves you. To me, the biggest revelation about Christianity was the idea that there's this sort of real delicate counterbalancing that you can do. You have to be humble to admit that you're so bad that God had to die to forgive your sins. And then on the other hand, you admit that you're so important to God that that God actually chose to forgive your sins because, that was a choice to endure that suffering. So to me, that is a really, really fascinating just sort of counterbalancing act. All right, reason number 3. As an atheist, everything that I didn't like about the Old Testament, all the reasons why I didn't believe in the Old Testament, became very persuasive through the lens of Jesus. So in other words, using Jesus as a lens to view the Old Testament suddenly validated and reinforced the Old Testament in ways that I found to be very, very surprising and, again, almost eerie. So in some ways, you can use Jesus as a hermeneutical key to sort of unlock the meanings of the Old Testament. I'll talk about what that means with like 3 different examples. All right, first of all, the story of Jonah never appealed to me. It's a weird story. It seems half-baked. He gets swallowed by a fish for 3 days. What does that mean? I don't believe that, especially as an atheist, I don't believe that could actually happen. I know some of the language that I'm using is irreverent. I won't get into it in this video, but I agree with like Justin Martyr, Clementine, and Origen, and many other original church founders who all agreed that you don't have to take the Old Testament literally. So I believe I don't sort of take the Old Testament literally, and I think that's fine for Christianity. I've talked about this in other videos, so I won't go too deeply into it. But my point is that the story of Jonah is a really half-baked story. First of all, there's a storm. He goes into a deep sleep on a boat. He's running away